Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. I am going to have to amplify a little bit up here, so I'm not mic'd. This is actually a fake mic. So I will try and do that. I'm happy that you chose to be with us in the SPIES group today. If you are here, and you should be in Venezuela, Venezuela is upstairs. This flight is going to Spyville, not Venezuela. You may disembark at this time. Okay. Spyville, I know, I'm telling you. So I'm Genevieve Lester. I am the academic chair of strategic intelligence here at the U.S. Army War College. So what I do is I lead more of the academic efforts on behalf of the college. That includes engaging with the students about strategic intelligence, engaging with outside partners, giving talks, engaging with the intelligence community, other parts of the military, and foreign universities generally. So I'm responsible for really our outreach efforts, for getting the word out about what we do here, and also for really boundary spanning, essentially making us part of the big conversation about intelligence writ large in the academic community, in the military community, and in the intelligence community. So we have a small group of us who deal with intelligence here. Some of them are in the room. I will not tell you who they are. You'll have to figure out where the spies are in the room by the end of this hour. That is your task. My background is in political science. I have a PhD in political science from University of California at Berkeley. So I have a unique background, some would say, for security studies, but it will all make sense by the end of this hour. So really what we're looking at here is this question: when should state secrets stay secret? And I'm going to disappoint you right now. There's not really an answer to this question. But what I'm going to do as we go over this about half an hour, and we'll hopefully have some time to discuss and engage with some of the more complex issues regarding intelligence, is look at ways we can think about this question. I'm an academic. I have to make ways for you to think. I can't give you answers because that would be way too easy. And we are paid to complexify, not make things simple. So other people here are trying to solve real problems. We're trying to make problems harder, and then we solve them. That's what the academics here do. So when should state secrets stay secret? So what are we looking at really when we're talking about intelligence and security out there? We're talking about a clicker that doesn't work. There we go. Too much machinery up here. So we're looking at tensions. None of this is straightforward. As I said, they're not answers to these questions. They're ways of thinking about problems. So we're looking at tensions in the security environment. So in order for security services, particularly intelligence services, to be effective, we need a certain level of secrecy, operational security, operational secrecy. It can't be known when something's about to happen, who's about to do it, where it's about to occur. It just can't. Otherwise, you will have failure in that operation. But in order for security services to abide by democratic norms, and we are talking intelligence and security in a democracy, and I must add here too, this is all quite US focused, what I'm about to talk about too. These issues that we're talking about are universal, but I'm speaking at it from a US perspective. And I say this for international audiences quite a bit too, because these are bigger issues, but we're looking at it through a US lens here. So in our democracy, in the US democracy, we expect our security services and our government agencies to abide by norms, to be transparent, to be accountable to the public. So what does this mean when we're talking about intelligence and we're talking about security? We're going to explore this. We're going to explore what it means and also how we deal with it, how we rectify lack of transparency. And I was just talking, I was at an event in Sweden a couple weeks ago, and one of the other speakers said, maybe transparency isn't the right word. Maybe we should talk about translucence, because transparency has an assumption built in that you can ever get to 100% see-through, 100% transparent, whereas translucent, and he's British, and he said, sort of like the frosty glass. You should think of it as the frosty glass, because you'll see shadows, but you will not ever really see the details. And so I ask you, as we talk about this balance that we always talk about, transparency, secrecy, security, openness, to think of it maybe with a layer on it, a certain layer of opacity, the frosted glass, because I think that gives you a slightly better sense of what this really is and how far we can go to knowing what is going on. When we're looking at how information, and we're going to be talking, you've been talking about DIME this week. We'll be talking about Big I with Jim Clapper on Thursday. We're talking about the role of information. Intelligence is part of information, and when we're looking at information within the government system, there is an information asymmetry among the branches of government. Executive branch owns this information. Others borrow it. And by that I mean The executive branch is owning all of this. It's in control of this information. It's gathering it. It's using it. And other branches of government borrow it when they want to know about what is going on. And I will show you the mechanisms for borrowing and lending as we go through this presentation. The big question here then is to how to balance this. Is this a balance? This balance between secrecy and openness. And what does that mean? So here's all of the elements of the intelligence community. You'll see them listed there on the left. Pretty straightforward. This is all under the auspices of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Jim Clapper, again, who will be coming on Thursday, is a former DNI who was charged with managing this whole conglomeration of 16 agencies plus one, plus the DNI. I'll break this down in the next slide, showing what these different elements do. So if you look at, those are the customers, the receivers of this information. There on the left, you see DNI, who's overall running this, and CIA underneath, and then the DoD, Department of Defense agencies. And they're responsible for all source analysis, collection, military support. And while the DoD agencies are especially responsible for military support, we're also seeing CIA be charged with that increasingly over the last couple of decades. Underneath this, we have more department-specific agencies. These are for the FBI, places we don't really think about. Most people don't think, oh, the Treasury has intel. Energy, DEA, State, INR is a small but important division of the State Department. DHS, Department of Homeland Security, that shows up in the news every now and then these days. These are all responsible for law enforcement, homeland, more niche operations. And then, of course, we come to the service-specific intelligence services. They support, as you can see, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, and Coast Guard. Coast Guard's actually supported by DHS. So what are we looking at? So far, we've covered, here's the tensions. Here are the different components of the intelligence community, and here's what we're looking at in the big picture. What is intelligence, though? I'm going to break it into two parts. There's intelligence as advantage and intelligence as activity. Advantage in this case is us gathering information to support our own senior decision making. Actually, this is decision making all the way through, but we're talking about policy level decision makings when we're talking about strategic intelligence. This helps us get an edge on what our adversaries are thinking and also what our allies are thinking, to understand the full mosaic of activities that are going on, to understand get situational awareness, understand dynamics, understand context throughout the world, so that we give our policymakers an edge in decision making, in diplomacy, in supporting all of these elements we're talking about. It allows you, decision advantage, it allows you to understand your adversary's vulnerabilities. That's what we're really getting at. We really want to understand the full picture here. And for those of you who are international relations enthusiasts, some of you must attest to this, in neo-realism, in the balance of power, this gives you the advantage. Intelligence can give you relative advantage over your adversary. So when we're looking at how intelligence works then, so we're going down, and this is stylized. It doesn't really work like this exactly, but it gives you a sense of you have planning and direction that starts this process, collection on those requirements, production analysis, dissemination, feedback. And this is how intelligence is going into the decision-making cycle. Again, this is stylized. It's just to give you a sense of the work plan that goes on in intelligence activities. So up to this point, we've got, here are the different elements. We can get back to some questions at the end if you have. I'm doing this very quickly so we can get to some of the bigger issues. But the intelligence community, the different parts of it, how it works, and what it's intended for. Now we're looking at a different part of intelligence. And some could say covert action is different from regular intelligence. I put it all together and say it has a different intention. It is covert action. Covert action is intelligence as activity. It is, in this case, the United States deciding to change the behavior or terrain in another country. It does this through a range of ways. Propaganda, political action, its engagement with elections, intelligence support, assisting other agencies, and paramilitary activity, which I think is probably the most commonly thought of. So this is intelligence as activity, as action, and versus intelligence as decision advantage, which is helping the decision process. It's action too, but it is not the same kinetic approach. Well, it's not all kinetic, but it's not activity like covert action. So why is covert action interesting for us? Covert action is interesting for us because it's just interesting. I think it's the sexiest part of intelligence, and I think everyone would agree, but not to get distracted by that. What is it? What makes it attractive? I'll let you read that for 1 second. The thing that makes it most attractive here is that the United States will not be acknowledged. It's the secret hand of the government. D is smiling over there. Yes. So this is why it's attractive, because it's the secret hand, the hidden hand of the government is not acknowledged. So this is obviously an attractive thing to a decision maker or a policymaker, because something happened, we cannot confirm or deny. What it is the third option between military action and diplomacy. I would argue that all of these things are bound up, that we use all of these elements all the time, but covert action has a special place. It's the third option. Tertia optio, third option. What are the principles of covert action? All these different types of activities. What are we looking at? We are looking at, it is, as the slide says, it's not a substitute for coherent practice. It is a tool to be used. And it's fully coordinated within the US government, and it's integrated. And I want to point this out to sort of disabuse of this idea that these guys are going off, they're rogue, they're indirected, they're not controlled. When I say any covert action that happens is very tightly controlled. And it's a policy process. It's very clear with a ton of attorneys. And I'll explain exactly how this works in the next slide when we talk about oversight and control of this tool. The goals must be clearly articulated. It's not a last resort. This is something that's a carefully used tool, and it must be compatible with values and interests. When I talk about that, I want to raise up in your own minds thoughts about ethics and covert action, and how intelligence and covert action, how one state determining the future of another state, determining the political activities or other activities in another country, is that or is it not ethical? I am not making a value judgment with this, but it is an interesting point to think about when we're talking about when should state secrets stay secret, how governments in secret operate, and how they're controlled, and how they are made to fit the norms of a democracy, which they are. So we come now, we've talked through different parts of intelligence. Intelligence is decision advantage. Intelligence is active measures. Now let's talk about what this means to maintain accountability over this. When should state secrets stay secret? And how do we penetrate this concept of total secrecy or total transparency? So what we've got is this concept of accountability. We have chains of accountability, that one entity is responsible to the next. We have given power as a democracy, as citizens, to these agencies to conduct these activities. How do we maintain this? We maintain accountability through the use of oversight mechanisms themselves. So this is how this all started. Legislating the Dark Side, I think, is my little spooky title there. One senior intelligence agency said his way, this is very specific to him, but his way of looking at oversight was, well, I try not to kill people, and they help me not do that. I thought, well, I think that's a little bit of an outlier statement. Did not include that in my book, so this is all Chatham House rule here, but that was an interesting thing. I thought, well, mind you, I was a graduate student at this time, talking to one of my first major spies, and sweat poured down my face as I'm listening to this guy talk about not killing people and those types of things that made it very real for me. I was an academic interested in this, and in this work, just as a brief aside here, this work is combining this theoretical framework with what is actually happening here. We're going in and out of these communities to understand what they do and how to support them, but also understanding and building bigger ways of thinking about them in an academic and more public way. So when you look at this, legislating the dark side, think back to coming out of World War II. At that point, with the use of intelligence was not really very smiled upon. What was its purpose in this post-World War II era? Especially when you're looking at World War II, when you're looking at domestic intelligence, you're looking at Gestapo, and you're looking at trying to align American values at that time with secret activities. So in the National Security Act, when we were putting together the agency and other entities, Function 5 was used as sort of a basket term. Other functions will be performed by CIA. This vagueness is the basis of covert action. That is where CIA grew its capabilities to conduct covert action. Between 1947 and 1974, very little oversight of this. Hughes-Ryan, 1974, came into being. Hughes-Ryan Amendment actually is to the 1961 Foreign Assistance Act, came into being because we're talking the 70s. We were looking at maybe failing institutions, Watergate, deep mire in Vietnam, wondering what government agencies were doing, certain military activities were occurring, and Congress engaged. So you see this 1974 is really a turning point with oversight and intelligence. With even the sense that this responsibility that Congress has to conduct oversight over branches of government should really be in place when it comes to intelligence matters. Up to that point, there were talks of gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail. We don't really want to know what's going on. You do handle that problem, but don't let us know about it on the part of Congress. These are sweeping statements, but that was the general sense. Then you hit 1974. Suddenly you have statutory support for oversight. You have a responsibility. What does Hughes-Ryan do? It requires that the executive branch develop a finding and that is signed by the president and is sent over to Congress. Why is this important? Because of that plausibility deniability concept that we started about before, that the hand of the government would be not acknowledged. Now, so that's plausible deniability. Now we're looking at, okay, the president has to be personally responsible for this. Internally, there is oversight. The president must assert that this activity, this action, necessary for foreign policy, important to national security, and again, ended this plausible deniability concept. What it did, then you send this over to Congress. Congress reviews this. They have this awareness that this is about to happen. So that was step one. 1975, we hear of abuses. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard about church committee hearings, and we were looking into things like that there was domestic use of the intelligence services, that COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Project, was looking at student groups. And my campus, of course, was a target, Berkeley, for student dissidents. They were in FBI, CIA, and NSA were all engaged in domestic activity. And it became a scandal. And I think this is an interesting trend when we look at intelligence and oversight scandal over the course of time. It's a domestic scandal that usually causes ire. We care much more, and this makes sense, what we do here versus what we do there. And I think that it creates a divide between domestic and foreign that is written into norm and law, but also is about the culture of this. So when we look at our own people being investigated, when you look at Snowden, regardless of how you feel about his activities, what he exposed domestically was shocking. So you see this trend line through the course of history showing that when you have a political scandal, that is where you get ire. You clamp down a little bit more on intelligence. When you've got failure, quote unquote, I use that in quotes because I think that the intelligence community does get blamed for failure a lot more than what is actually only theirs to own. Then you see an opening. So when you see failure in terms of post 9/11 period, when you see the failure to communicate, the failure of the FBI and CIA to interact, and the failure of imagination, which is this should have been foreseen. Then we see an opening of intelligence. So I think there are a lot of pieces here. I'm throwing a lot of pieces at this at you because I think it's important to understand all of these moving parts that are happening. We've got this sort of sine wave that's happening. Church committee marked a high point of that. This is when, 1975, I had only been alive for a little bit of time. And this was the first exposure. People were seeing pictures. They saw an infamous picture of a dart gun. They saw a lot of the activities being exposed people didn't know about. And I think that is an important thing to think of in 1975 as a crucial turning point, because I wonder, and I think about this in my research too, would we be as shocked today if this stuff came out? We probably wouldn't. We're exposed to a lot more information on a continuous basis. We know a lot more now. We have known for decades now what the secret or the intelligence agencies are kind of up to, but at that point it was different. We were coming out of a lot of turmoil, talking about President Nixon, Vietnam, Watergate, a lot of shaking in the institutional structures and governance. What does our country look like? We're in a new era, and that was a real break point in terms of how intelligence is seen. So shortly after that, in 1977 and 1976, you have the Senate and House, respectively, setting up oversight committees, select oversight committees. 1978, you have the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which organizes and controls wiretapping. Gradually, as you see this, and this is one of the things when I'm talking about this sine wave, and I'm talking about opening and closing and thinking about intelligence, you gradually see here a new sort of wave going on, which is when you look at accountability, when we talk about accountability, there's an assumption built in that transparency is a part of it. That accountability means transparency. I would argue, and in my work I argue this quite a bit, that actually, while we are looking at this development, and we're looking at these statutes develop and these norms and customs of behavior, we're actually seeing a closing in of availability of this information. By this I mean, the findings This makes the president responsible for these activities. It also makes that the actions are written out with their objectives very clear. They can be reviewed. They are subject to legal review. We've got this sort of in tight order. 1975, we see this sort of explosion. The year of intelligence is what one author talks about. This is where all this stuff is exposed to the public. Then you see the Oversight Committee set up. This is great. They're specialized. They develop knowledge about all of this, and they have it there. They have access to reports. They've got high clearances. We see a systemization, an institutionalization oversight setting up there. 1980, we start seeing the reporting narrow in. Now the intelligence agencies only report to these oversight agencies, shrinking this down from 8 committees before that. At this point, then you can also have limited reporting there. If something is too secret, too sensitive, you can report to the Gang of 8, which is leadership in House and Senate and leadership of both committees. So we're looking at this, and I urge you to think about this. We think of institutionalization of process as definitely supporting accountability and openness, but we're also seeing here is almost a countervailing impulse, which is we will create expertise, we will create system, we'll create process, and that actually narrows in who actually is dealing with this stuff, who has exposure to it. Right? You go from anyone having access to it who wanted it to 8, potentially. 12333 lines out, again, 1981, the who does what in the intelligence community, and then Intelligence Authorization Act of 1991 is pretty much where we stand now, and that really talks about the timeliness of reporting, that the committee should be currently and timely, they should have knowledge in a current and timely fashion, and knowledge about covert action should happen within 48 hours. So that is where we pretty much stand right now. So this is a development over the course of time. Again, the takeaway from this is we start with huge vagueness and we gradually refine. And questions remain. Process is good. We all, I mean, those of us who work for the Army War College know and respect our bureaucracy because it is everywhere. This is what this is doing too. We're creating a bureaucracy to balance, to try and balance the information asymmetry with the intelligence agencies. When we look, so that's the big picture. That's the legal and structural approach to the development of oversight. So what I wanted to do when I started looking at this stuff is to really think about, how do we break this down? How do we think of it in a more granular level? How do we think about it in a way we can gauge? Can we measure this? How good is oversight? How bad is it? Are we comparatively bad at this, comparatively good compared to other countries? Of course, we are better than every other country at this, but I will show you how. So we really need to then look into different ways of accountability. What I have talked to you about up to this point is external. This is how we control, constrain, and develop institutions around intelligence. But what we're missing from that picture is how intelligence is managed internally. And that is really crucial to this. Again, I mentioned already the rogue element, the rogue elephant hypothesis, which is that the CIA is, by the way, I'm focusing mainly on CIA because that is really where covert action lies, and covert action is really the core of oversight when it comes to development. So as you saw from the very beginning, there are 17 agencies whole, 16 who are running things. CIA just is the focus. So I'm not trying to neglect them to be mean. I'm just focusing this because this is where the engine is for a lot of this. So when we're looking at this, we've got the external. We've got legislative, the 2 House and Senate committees. We've got the judiciary involved. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act set up the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISC, the FISC, which reviews orders for wiretapping, et cetera, secretly. Internally, though, what are we looking at? We're looking at total control of this information. Within the executive branch, control, NSC, president, these relationships, and also mechanisms within the CIA itself. It's a bureaucracy that's running this. So you've got mechanisms to control all the way up. You've got a hierarchy, you've got an Office of General Counsel, you've got rules, you've got an Inspector General. All of this is happening while the external and controlling this and make sure it's legal, making sure it aligns, while external is doing the same thing from the outside. They have, however, different goals. So internal is how to balance the operational requirements that we started out with talking about with the transparency expected in a democracy. So how are we aligning what we're doing internally with external expectations? And when you think about internal accountability, there's some things you should think about. How the hierarchy is set up, how complex the organization is, how the activity adheres to legal constraints. And I'm thinking about this when you're measuring how well this works. The process itself, recourse and internal autonomy. Recourse, how can they change behavior? How can these bodies change behavior if they see something they don't like, they see something breaking the law potentially, or breaking a norm, breaking a rule? How can they change that? What is their recourse? Internal autonomy. When you're talking about internal accountability, how autonomous is this institution from the rest of the agency itself? Can it skip the chain of command? Who does it report to? And this is really spelled out when you talk about inspectors general, who report to two different bodies. They report to the director, for example, in this case, the CIA, statutory inspector general, and also to Congress. So how autonomous is this body in terms of maintaining internal control and adherence to legal constraints? These are things to be thinking about. External accountability, again, is the balance with legislative and judiciary. What are we thinking about when we think, okay, so think about the SISI, the Senate Select Committee for Intelligence. We're thinking about, what do they know? What are their knowledge conditions? By this, I mean, how much do they know about the activities? And how skilled are they? What is their knowledge base? Because you've got principal elected members, and you've got their staffs. So the staffs, they're not huge, but they tend to have specialized awareness. But when you're thinking about specialized knowledge of the community, that's how they're chosen. But when you're thinking about that, think of the wide variety of activities the intelligence community is engaged with. You can probably understand a very straightforward paramilitary activity. But how easy is it to understand how a satellite works? Or intricacies of highly technologically advanced collection and wiretapping, that type of thing. There's a range of activities happening here, and in order to understand what's going on and oversee them, you need to have certain expertise. So it's important to count this in when we're thinking about how effective external oversight is, because we're balancing that against internal accountability, where you've got total control, total knowledge, total awareness of what you're doing. Again, autonomy. And then we get down to organizational complexity is the same. It's looking at how complex the organization is that you are supervising. Temporality and transparency. Temporality is, when does oversight occur? If you're balancing internal, total control, versus external, you get a finding, possibly in a timely fashion, but around 48 hours. Or you hear about it after the fact. And your only recourse to change this activity is power of the purse. Power of the purse is an important thing in Congress, but it doesn't happen immediately. So when is this happening in temporality? And when does control happen? All the time, versus maybe a lag time when it comes to external accountability. Transparency again, or translucence. How transparent are the activities to your overseen and also to other members of Congress, for example? So we're looking at this. I've already mentioned most of this, but just to reiterate, we've looked at how this works. We've looked at covert action. We've looked at how oversight has developed briefly. And then we're looking at where some friction points are, where some important things are about this in terms of information is owned versus borrowed. Recourse is after the fact and weak, generally, externally. So I would think about I'm to sort of pedagogically and annoyingly, to think about what does it look like when Congress has to react to something? How quick are they? How unified are they? Is that recourse? Is that changeability? Do they have that power? Do they have that unity to change activities? It's something to think about in terms of how strong this external oversight actually is. And again, what does transparency mean? The timeliness, sufficiency of reporting, trust is crucial here. And I'd want to interest something. So we've seen these institutional structures, and for any of you who wonder, I can talk about this for 100,000 hours. This is really the very brief briefing. If you want to sit here for 100,000 hours, we can totally get into this. But I'm open to questions. I realize this is really broad brush. So we've talked about these different ways of looking at the intelligence community, talked about the development of oversight, but I really want to bring in the piece of the public here. Because when I was originally doing my work, we didn't talk about this the same way. Now we look at the media and the public as an additional branches, as an additional oversight. And when I say here a desperate solution, I was talking about leaks. And I bring up that in the ethical framework. Is it ever okay for one individual to decide to leak classified information? Should we consider that an actual oversight mechanism? Is that just breaking the law? Or does it have a role? And this is an open question. I'm not trying to lead you anywhere other than to think about this, but does it have a role in actually maintaining accountability of government agencies, or is this sort of the seduction of potential fame? If you look at an Edward Snowden, some people thought he was a hero, think he is. Some people think he is a traitor. Others think his personality, because he wanted fame, he wanted something, that it was more about him and his personality rather than these larger gestures. And that's reinforced, this is just the general argument, by those who suggest that his point would have been made more strongly if he had come back to face what he needed to face from our legal system. So there are questions about this. What is your motivation? Does your motivation matter if you're leaking information? You may have something that you think the public needs to know. Is that ever okay? And what is the individual's responsibility within this context? Again, these are open questions. I'm not trying to make value judgments about them or talk about how their efficacy. I just want to bring this out because we really have to grapple with this a lot more. We are dealing with a much different time period than Church Committee, when that was shocking that these activities were exposed. Now we're exposed to sometimes to information earlier than decision makers. We as the public here are engaged in this. We are engaged in accountability. We are engaged in holding government agencies to account. Whether we feel that empowerment all the time is an open question, but I think it should be brought out on the table to talk about this and talk about what is appropriate. So when we're looking at this, we've seen how norms and legal structures were built over time in relationship to the executive. So if you look at the relationships that I talk about in the development of legislating the dark side, you see this relationship between Congress and the executive. You see a push-pull. You see the executive wanting to continue to own this information, and you see Congress pushing back at these different times, saying, no, Mr. President, you are now going to have to write that you are responsible and that there's a reason for these covert actions. We are going to want this to happen in a timely fashion. We want this to be reported to our oversight committees so that we have control over this. We want to be briefed. We will call you in when we want to be briefed. We are taking responsibility from you in this balance of secrecy and transparency. And that engagement is really crucial to the whole thing. None of this stuff is developing in a straight line. The role of the public has waxed and waned. And I think with the help of technology, we see huge changes recently, and I think we will continue to see huge changes as artificial intelligence and other types of technology really gain traction in the public sphere. But we really are looking at a different framework and different expectations. And also as we develop, as I talked about, scandals and failures and how we open and close intelligence. I mean by, okay, we open some certain aspects of intelligence up through the Patriot Act. Certain capabilities were opened. We could more collaboration, this is post 9/11, between FBI, CIA, law enforcement, national intelligence. We opened that. But that is again part of this whole waxing and waning, the public role of these things, public pushback, public awareness. We're at a very different stage when it comes to awareness of government activities now because we have so much more information. Throughout all of this, I think this, after years and years of study, sort of banal to say, but it really does come back to trust. And I think when we're looking at oversight mechanisms happening right now, you see, especially in the House, some deep politicization of oversight. And what does that mean? I don't mean to get into the political question right here, but what does it mean when oversight is politicized? The norm for many decades was politics stops at the water's edge, bipartisanship, that national security was everybody's responsibility. And we saw that break down a little bit. And we've all asked ourselves as oversight people, well, what does that mean? Break down forever. There'll be no oversight, no trust, nothing. Oh my God, sky is falling. I am more optimistic, and I think we can rebuild those relationships, and I think that's actually happening now. I think that that opened up a sense of how vulnerable our institutions are actually to politics. And I think we've seen that in a lot of ways, but oversight always had this special role because it's bipartisan, there was trust involved. There's a lot of trust in borrowing information. Again, executive branch owns this information and Congress borrows it. By that I mean they have a right to it, but they have to ask the right questions. There are dynamics at play that mean they might not get the whole picture right away, Congress. So there's trust involved there. There's also, I think that when we talk about oversight and oversight mechanisms, it can make it sound like the intelligence community, again, is this rogue, crazy thing. It is not. And many intelligence people I've spoken to, and it's a lot of senior officials that I spoke to, would really like to share the responsibility with oversight. Let's not be the ones who are totally responsible for failure Let's share this. We have been briefing you. Don't say, we never knew about that. You're doing that thing totally on your own. We are not supporting it. Congress, hands off. Blame sharing here would actually be very, very helpful for efficacy on how these projects work and also for building this trust that runs throughout all of this. Again, I'm optimistic. I think I'm always optimistic about this. I was briefing on this. I was trying to wend my way through some political dimensions of our current political situations for a group of Norwegians. And they asked me to explain everything. And you can imagine how easy that was to explain our current political situation right now. But ultimately, I come to this here too, after a long time studying this and being engaged with all aspects of the intelligence community and oversight. These are resilient institutions. We have seen them wax and wane. We see them grow and shrink. We see intelligence capacities opening and closing, but we see this, and we see oversight developing alongside. They don't always match up. Oversight's not always 100%, but we do see waxing and waning, and we see resiliency of these institutions, and it's built on trust. So as one final statement, that is a lot of ways of looking at intelligence. I know that it's about 100,000 feet what I just did, at about 100,000 miles an hour. But we do have time for questions, and I wanted to just bring this all back to when should state secrets stay secret? I hope that I showed you ways of thinking about that question, because sadly, and I wrote a book titled that, actually, and that's the question I always get, well, when? There isn't an answer to that, but there are a lot of ways of thinking about it, and there are a lot of institutions engaged with that question, and a big piece of the culture and the fabric of our democracies engaged with that question. So I leave you with that, and I hope to answer any questions. I also have located some convenient spies in this audience if you've got more specific questions that they can answer. Yes, please.
I'm a little bit hearing impaired. I had trouble hearing a lot of what you said. I apologize if I'm asking you something that you've already addressed.
Sorry not to project.
Your point of the risk of partisanship to oversight is very interesting to me. Of more interest is the risk of harm from partisanship in the intelligence community itself. I don't know where the truth lies as an outsider, of course, but the risk of partisanship within the FBI, the risk of partisanship or the appearance of partisanship from former heads of our intelligence community now speaking out in such partisan ways. To me, regardless of where the truth lies and regardless of where one's politics are, I'm concerned about the level of harm that might be done by the appearance of partisanship as well as by actual partisanship. I wonder if you have any comments on that.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I'm sorry, I'm trying to project. I'm not mic'd up here, so can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I think that this is, the perception piece that you brought up in this, I think is the crucial point, because I actually think, there are a lot of opinions on this, and some of these are fraught issues, but my feeling is we see serious professionalism happening in these agencies. I am personally not worried about internal activities changing because of partisan ideology or commitment to those ideologies. That in that way, I am more, if me as a private citizen, as a citizen, I'm more worried of the look of partisanship and the fact that that is now played up a lot when we're talking about speaking of a head of an agency and saying that they're traitors and that their clearances should be taken and those extreme political viewpoints. I think that is harm, because I do think in a normative, ideal world, these positions would be apolitical. So I think regardless of the activities that are happening themselves, and I think that we're talking serious professionals who have invested their entire lives in these agencies. So I'm not worried about that, but this fact that these roles have actually been politicized and are that way, and that people are speaking this way, I think is a little dangerous to the fabric. But I don't think it's really dangerous. I think we will bounce back from that. I do think that we're in a hard place that way, though. I agree.
About advocacy. Kennedy famously said bad pigs wouldn't have happened if the New York Times had published. I'm curious whether you have a sense about whether the increasing transparency, desired or otherwise, or oversight, desired or otherwise, is affecting advocacy.
That's a good question.
Can you repeat the question?
I asked whether oversight, desired or otherwise, is harming advocacy.
Well, when you get back to this, an academic, of course, I first have to question, what is efficacy? What does it look like, and how do we measure it? I think that there are a lot of different things, and there are a lot of pieces of the community I'm talking about. Covert action is just one of them. And there's some things I can't really speak to on that, but I think that the overall sense is, no, I don't think so. Mark, did you want to jump in before?
Yeah, just I'm Mark Twombly. I'm the DCI faculty representative to the Army Law Corps College. This September I've been in the agency 30 years. So I can tell you from the inside, I can't tell you the political affiliation of anybody I work with. It just doesn't really come up. And it does not factor into how we make decisions, how we follow operations. It just, I'm here, I teach in the National Security and Strategy Department here, and we have a big section on civil-military relations where we go over, the apolitical nature of, to a large extent, that just carries right over into the intelligence community. CIA, we were born out of the U.S. military, out of OSS during World War II, and that carries on through. So when you hear these statements about there is a deep state, it does a lot of morale harm to the workforce. At the end of the day, you tune it out, you go back to work, and you do the work. And you provide, I've worked through, 5 different administrations now. It never really mattered who was in the White House. We do our job and we provide information to the president and the other policymakers, regardless of what party they're from. When they politicize it, when those outside the intelligence community and outside the government are now increasingly inside the government start politicizing, it makes it harder to get the job done.
And also to add on to that, I think too, because the intelligence community, it's not appropriate for active intelligence officers to comment on these things. So this gets very skewed.
By law.
Exactly. So when you do have the politicization of this, when you have one figure who's speaking in a certain way, they're not arguing back. And I think that's what we really find throughout this whole process. They get blamed for a lot of stuff and don't argue back. And that's why you get this dynamic, I would argue. Did you want to?
Yeah, no, I mean, we're not allowed under the Hatch Act. We're not allowed to make political statements publicly or even privately. So it does put us. We rely on. We have to rely on others outside the intelligence community, and there really isn't a constituency. It's really easy to beat up on the IC because we have no domestic constituency at all.
Yeah, you just have to absorb the blame, which is why.
Yeah, we're used to it.
Yeah, good. Yes, please.
Yes, you emphasized trust 2 or 3 times. Would you elaborate a little bit on the trust factor within the agencies?
When I talk about trust a lot, it's between branches of government. I mean generally Congress and executive here when we're talking about oversight. So if you're going to share a source, for example, with Congress, you need to be sure that they're going to not blow that source, so that they're not going to expose sources and methods, for example. So there's a lot of built-in trust when it comes to that these are sensitive projects. So when they go over to Congress, they're not going to be leaked. Now, there are a lot of questions about who actually does the leaking when it comes to this, because it's usually not Congress. But that is one piece of the trust puzzle here. Another one is that a lot of these activities, the relationship between oversight and intelligence itself, and intelligence meaning the whole community, is very relational. So, for example, you will see that it's crucial that, for example, the DCIA have a good relationship with the president, that the DNI needs to have a really good relationship with the president to make sure that this information flows, so there has to be trust there. And I would argue that it's relational in a lot of ways. In the committees, many of the staffers are drawn from the intelligence community because they have the knowledge that they need, that type of thing. So there's trust established there that the community's needs are being represented to the overseers as well. And I basically talk about that a lot because I think it's juxtaposed with what we normally think of as secret agencies running crazy. And I know I keep bringing that up, but throughout the literature, for decades, that is what people thought of agencies doing, that they were doing this on their own, especially CIA. Because the cool stories came out of CIA and they were off doing this stuff in jungles or wherever, and there was no control. That is in fact not the case. So when I talk about trust, it's to juxtapose it with that sense that they're detached. All of these entities are engaged in resilient relationships. Does that get anywhere for you?
Yeah, well, because in reference to trust, you hear this administration being very critical of the FBI and some of these other agencies. How do you mesh and continue to do your job when they're talking about bipartisan, that this person is a Democrat, they're a Republican, that's why they made this particular decision? How do you build that trust?
Well, I think that's what Mark was just talking about too. He really touched upon where it is really, I think that the systemization of these agencies is important to remember. They're bureaucracies. So people are just doing their jobs. And I think that you get an overlay of the politics. But again, I think you do get people who, as Mark said, you put your head back down and do the job and try not to hear the external noise, to be honest with you. I think it does do harm. And Mark, maybe you would want to add in. When you talk about the president, for example, discounting the estimates of the intelligence community and not aligning and not supporting its intelligence function, I think that there is danger in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that it's unfortunate. But I do really trust maybe because I've got a couple spooks in this room, I really do trust the professionalism of them, because I think that's really what it comes down to.
You referred to several legislative items for oversight. Quite the opposite are opportunities for empowerment. You know, and in this arena, it's hard to talk about that without talking about the Patriot Act. Can you speak quickly to that? As perhaps, was that an overstatement or an overreach? How does that pass this litmus test that you've thrown at us today of when should state secrets remain state secret?
The Patriot Act itself, was it an overreach in terms of what it allowed to happen?
Well, I mean, you talked about oversight and looking into it, and then this was, you know, recent legislation that opened the doors for intelligence and intelligence professionals to look in spots without oversight in many cases.
Well, I think that there was still oversight. What I think it did is it did
loosened, yes.
Well, it expanded the capability. It allowed things that, you know, we talk about this, the wall between foreign and domestic law enforcement intelligence. It dropped that wall a little bit more so that you could blend law enforcement and intelligence activities, you know, at a deeper level, things like that. I think in terms of what it was responding to, it was responding to emergency, and nobody really knew what it was. There were a lot of things that happened then. For example, DHS was stood up. It was an amalgam of these different agencies. There were a lot of different reasons for why this happened, because one of them, not to sound very skeptical, but was to show that we were doing something. We needed to react to this. We needed to show the world and our own populace that we had political response to it. So that was DHS as one outcome of that, I think. And I think it was an interesting idea to bring these capabilities together. And I've actually spoken recently about what even domestic intelligence, that type of thing, means. And we really saw that being introduced into our populace in a different way, this concept. A lot of these different things. I think when you look back to the way we did, I don't know if you remember the color-coded index that happened right then, and suddenly we're at orange. Well, what do you do when it's orange? I mean, versus green or red? What do you get in your basement? I mean, you know, that was never, and the actual backstory to that was that it was not supposed to be for public. It was supposed to be interagency. Then they would know what to do. But I think that back then, I mean, I'm slightly going to one side of your question, but I'm really looking at the societal engagement at that time, that suddenly we were looking at individuals being more engaged in this whole period of time. And if you look at some of the websites, this is really far afield, but ready.gov, it was the DHS's, their sort of preparedness site. If you look at the language on that site and what it advises you to do, it's the same, in some cases, as the 1950s civil defense guidance. Duck and cover, you know. And there was a time when I gave a presentation when I would sing the Bert the Turtle song, Bert the Turtle says duck and cover. Do you think that that was from the 1950s, duck under your desk, prepare for a nuclear blast? You think that society was engaging in that way. So in terms of Patriot Act, in terms of what I think we saw a whole societal change at that time. And so when should state secret stay secret? I think we closed in a little bit. We allowed greater capability, but that pushed back on maybe civil liberties, that type of thing. So that failure led to greater empowerment. Does that help get anywhere? Okay. Chris?
Yeah, so his question about the Patriot Act kind of preempted a little bit of what I was going to ask. So when should states keep state secrets? You mentioned the history of what happened here, the church committee, and a lot of people were surprised, and frankly, society was surprised by a lot of what was happening then. But what the Patriot Act is not a function of the shock and surprise of the disclosure that Snowden made and that Manning made. Is that not in part, is it fair not to say that that's partly a result of a disinterested public that did not pay attention to information that was publicly available about the Patriot Act and what the expanded capabilities were for the intelligence community?
You mean,
I think that this is a statement then a question back. But I think that the public should not be shocked by those disclosures because that sort of expansion was made known to people.
I agree, and mind you, Chris Wyatt, who is our director of Africa Studies, has probably heckled every talk I've ever given. So this is a very nice question.
Listen, so I set her up for success. This is how she thinks. By the way, full disclosure, I'm a career Army intelligence officer. I've worked at the National Security Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency, and written for the president. So.
Well,
That's a boast, I guess.
That is a boast, but I think you make a really
She's
good.
always calling me on this thing.
We've worked together a long time, you can tell. But I think you really bring up an interesting point too, back to also what I was talking about in 1975 when these things were shocking.
Yeah.
So I would argue, a function of a lot of different things. People don't really think too much about legislation. It's in the weeds, it's detailed, it's arcane, it's technical, so there's not a lot of attention paid. I think it's weird for us in the bubble that we're operating in to think that. But to a large degree, the public is disengaged. And also 24-hour news cycles, continual, breaking news, shocking, new thing, red headlines has numbed people to new news, I think, in a way, that you could say about a lot of different things that are happening in our society right now. So I think those things were shocking when they came out. And I think that the leaks, I think there are a couple different pieces. The information itself, also the fact that someone would do that, I think was really surprising. The leakers themselves, and it brings us back to the problems or the problematization of when should someone do that? Should someone do that? Is it ever ethical or moral to be a leaker? And those are open questions, I think, that we asked about at some time, but I don't think the details themselves were that shocking. I mean, we were kind of used to these things happening at that time. So I guess I agree with you, yeah.
Well, but certainly in the media and certainly in public discourse where people were talking about it, people acted shocked, and that's the thing that puzzled me. I mean, it wasn't a great state secret what these things were happening if you were paying attention. And I realize, as you just said, it's not something that people pay daily attention to. But my question is, if it's not like it was fully hidden from the public,
Right.
like what used to be done.
Right. When these things were completely opaque, we were actually almost at a natural place of translucence, to use that term.
And that opaqueness was protected back in the 60s.
It was, exactly. And I think that when also a senior leader said this, a senior intelligence leader said, maybe we should think of ways to inform the public more and make the public more relational and resilient in these types of relationships. Because again, just like with Congress, it's a blame sharing or it's responsibility sharing in some way. Blame is too strong. But if we allow people to have more awareness and allow the public to have more awareness of what's being done on their behalf, what role they have in this, what we're doing, what the United States is doing, and how that aligns with our values and interests, that may make a more resilient relationship between intelligence and the public. This is an argument that was made because rather than that, we tend to have these moments of shock that get very extreme. Yeah.
Some of that is twofold, right?
Mhm.
Say it's not shocking now. The same is the fact that what was released,
Right.
the American public wasn't just shocked by it because they didn't know. You know what I mean?
Do you mean like in the 70s or
say,
yeah?
Hey, we had these leakers, you know, Chelsea, Bradley, Manning, and Snowden, and unless someone went and watched the movie or something,
Yeah.
or something that they don't really know what they released, so they're not even that upset about it because they don't even realize what they lost or what was damaged to them.
Or they know little bits and pieces.
Yeah,
You
they
know.
don't, the average American doesn't, they don't know that.
And,
They don't know
yeah.
what risk they got put at by.
Well, and you know,
so
exactly, and what the risk is and what
if
it
they knew,
means.
they would go kill a guy, right? You know what I mean? If they really knew how much risk.
Or
they
if the
took.
risk that if anyone really
Right.
knew, because there's an ambiguity there. You know, we can factor that in, we can gauge.
So it's a two-way street. The Patriot Act, it might have been ambiguous about it. The same thing goes for what was actually released and people protesting against.
And I think there are layers to that, exactly like what you're saying. So what people know, or if they're paying attention to the leak at all, who the person is, what that stuff is, and what that even means. How do you place what was leaked into a bigger context, which I guess is what we're sort of getting at here today, talking about some of this stuff. How does this work? Where should we be? Where are the question points? And that's why I always disappoint, I fear, because I don't have all the answers.
I think with Mark talking about the partisanship or non-partisanship, there is any institution, there is some groupthink, I think that happens,
Yes.
right? That institutions sort of buy in what they believe.
Well-
I mean, you know, the counterterrorism folks are not going to tell you that there's not a terrorist control out there.
Right.
You know what I mean? You buy into what you believe in.
But I think that happens in every institution. I think
Yeah,
you
the
look
post
at,
office will tell you that
exactly,
there's no
or you know, second day air or whatever, yeah.
I mean,
And
that happens, and sometimes that might even appear to be partisanship.
well, that, and also I think we need to be realistic, and this is why I kind of want to, I hate to do this because, I mean, of course, I study it, I think it's fascinating, but I think there's a banality of bureaucracy that is built into this whole structure too, which is you are going to do things, groupthink happens because you are pressured to come up with a decision. It's not like you just want to be a sheep. You have to unite, you have to move things forward, you've got to get promoted, you've got real constraints to your behavior, and I think that operating outside of any kind of intel or specialized occupation, that happens in every bureaucracy. So I think it's important to build that in, that there are some normal parts of life that happen here that just because you want to get to the next level, you're going to do. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's a positive. It's internal norms. You're reacting to the internal expectations of your agency. I think we're about out of time, but I'm actually happy to talk to people up here if you, oh, yeah, one more.
Just one quick question, not to keep beating on partisanship, but from an oversight perspective, are there limitations on the number of presidential appointees allowed within the intelligence community? Across, I mean, when we're in the DoD, we see multiple presidential appointees within the Pentagon, so on and so
How
forth.
many?
So that's kind of a reinforcing mechanism to drive partisanship.
That's few, actually. Do you,
The CIA has 2 presidential appointees, our director and our inspector general. That's it.
Which means, you know, careerists are the ones that are really kind of driving it.
Yeah.
Keeping things in order. Okay.
Career officers, not like career.
but I think that makes it different. That dynamic definitely makes it different. Thank you very much.